أيها الأخوة والأخوات، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، وأهلا ومرحبا بكم معنا في اليوم الثالث للفعاليات العلمية للمنتدى الدولي الأول لأنسنة المدن. ونبدأ صباح هذا اليوم بالجلسة السادسة عشر التي يترأسها الدكتور طلال الردادي، الأستاذ المساعد بجامعة الملك سعود بالرياض والأمين العام الأسبق لهيئة تطوير المدينة. وهذه الجلسة بعنوان المدينة الإنسانية، التصميم الحضري. فليتفضل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أفضل الأنبياء المرسلين نبينا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة والتسليم. There is a slight change in the program. Today we add on Mr. Locus Skoll. He was going to present Abu Dhabi complete sustainable communities. Mr. Locus is the urban design manager at the Abu Dhabi Department of Urban Planning and Municipalities. He's responsible for advising the Abu Dhabi government on matters regarding urban design, master planning, and strategic development. He heads the DBM's Urban Design Studio, which serves as the internal think tank and project design and development consultancy responsible for exploring, developing, and testing government initiatives and innovation related to the built environment. Mr. Locus.
Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, and esteemed colleagues, I apologize, the presentation will be in English because my Arabic is really not that strong. Over the past few days, we've seen some amazing initiatives from many places around the world regarding the humanizing of cities. My presentation is a little bit more humble. We've seen some amazing projects, some actually done in Abu Dhabi, but it's important to note that sometimes, as Charles Landry also mentioned, the ordinary is the extraordinary. And since housing fills, could say, literally about half of the land of cities, it's important to focus on this. So I'll be sharing Abu Dhabi's attempt at humanizing cities by creating complete sustainable communities. I'll go through three sections. One where I'll share our Abu Dhabi vision, much like your 2030 vision, how then we develop tools to try to implement it, and then a quick case study of how those tools are actually being manifested in design itself. So Abu Dhabi also has a vision. It's called the Abu Dhabi Plan. Its aim is to secure a confident society that aims to develop competitive, sustainable, and globally open economy. The critical thing is in achieving this, we need to define some key performance indicators, some way to measure what we're trying to do. So this vision is split into 5 sectors, which have 25 goals and 83 programs. This is very ambitious, but it covers the entire Abu Dhabi government. The two most relevant to master planning are the goal of social development, which is to do social development that guarantees a decent life for all members of the society. And the programmatic action is to provide suitable housing under a sustainable system. This, of course, requires infrastructure to implement. So the goal there is to do an integrated urban areas, meeting the needs of community and quality of life, with the program to do integrated planning to meet the region's development and sustainability requirements. In order to do this, we put all these goals and visions and principles into a larger context, into what we call the Department of Urban Planning and Municipalities planning tools, or the design suites. So at the top, of course, we have the vision, which leads all initiatives. Underneath it, we have our Estadama program, which, as you know, Estadama in Arabic means sustainability. In the Abu Dhabi context, it's a little bit unique because we have 4 pillars. in addition to environmental, economic, and social, we also have cultural sustainability. It is deemed that the culture of the citizens and the unique culture of Abu Dhabi is critical and needs special attention to be preserved. Then it's also implemented with an economic vision and plan. In terms of the DPM context, we then developed 4 urban structure framework plans. The unique one here is the maritime, which is the blue one on the left, which actually creates an urban framework, or rather a framework for the seas as well, because that's where a lot of the assets are, both economic and environmental. And the connection to the sea has always been critical to the culture as well. In order to implement this, we've created a planning manual suite, which hopes to ensure that we meet this, and that generates master plans. From the master plans, we then have development code and policies and regulations to ensure that what is built there is also aligned with the vision. So how does this facilitation development actually work? So we take the vision, both the Abu Dhabi plan and Estidama, we create the frameworks, and the manuals of how to get there are essentially the tools to bring us to the master plans. This isn't only for the government. We, of course, have several developmental partners, and through the development review process, also done by our organization, we work with developers in order to get the implementation that we seek. So our vision is definitely about sustainable development. The mission, the key word there is, again, complete sustainable communities. We see that this manual suite ensures that the vision is met. It actually expedites approvals and processes because the goals are aligned, which then facilitates implementation. A lot of this is necessitated by an integrated design process. So the vision, the goals, the principles, and the guidelines are part of design, which improves coordination, enhances efficiency, and hopefully gets us to a better quality of life or more humane cities, and that will bring us complete sustainable communities. So I'd just like to highlight some of the manuals within the suite. So there's actually 3 related to the sustainability initiative of Estidama. This is based on the LEED system, which I'm sure many of you know, which is from the US. However, it was not completely transferable to the UAE, so there was about 2 or 3 years of development where it was specifically tailored to the climate and culture to make it viable. And it looks at communities, buildings, and then villas themselves for local housing. We also have a safety and security planning manual, because the best safety and security measures are done at the early stages of planning and development, not as retrofits, of course. We then have community facility planning. Mosque development regulations stand on their own because they needed a special attention, of course. Community facility planning standards, which include schools and clinics and facilities like that. And then we also have a public realm design manual, which deals with parks and sports facilities, but it also deals with right-of-ways and streets, which is part of the last suite, which is urban street design manual and utility corridors. So the theory is that if we apply all of these initiatives together, that we will reach complete sustainable communities. However, it's clear that we cannot just follow numbers, and a lot of participation and coordination has to be done with the government. So this is where all those suites have been coordinated with our partners within the government, with municipalities, DOT, tourism, Awqaf, environmental agency, and everybody. And then this brings certain benefits. They can again be brought back and characterized by the Estidama initiative with those 4 priorities of environmental, economic, social, and cultural. In this presentation, I'd like to focus on the social and cultural. I think it's the most relevant to humanizing cities, not that the other 2 aren't important. But what we've really trying to do is look at reduced accidents, crime reduction, a lot of SEPTED principles of making sure that there's eyes on the street. A critical one in the design is improved public health, because we've had many colleagues here talk about sidewalks and cycle paths and things like that, which actually bring health back into the community. We've also heard yesterday about the importance of some of the cultural assets, about increasing civic pride, and that it's culturally specific and relevant to the residents of the communities. Now, this is also important because building that community is essentially building the relationship amongst the neighbors, building the support mechanisms, and building a long-lasting neighborhood. So this is a breakdown of where each of those manuals contribute. So I'd like to take a look at a case study. I'll give you a quick image of Abu Dhabi. So this is not uncommon. You can see in the area to the north, these are neighborhoods that were primarily developed during the boom of the 90s. So you can see they're characterized by very broad right-of-ways, so very large streets, a lot of unattended land, a lot of areas left over in planning. And although it was necessary at the time because the speed of development was such that a lot of planning could not take terms to optimize land and increase efficiency, this was what resulted. It's not, livability there isn't bad, there's still basic services, but in terms of humanizing, this is not necessarily a humane environment for walking, for creating a community, for meeting at the mosque after prayers, for knowing your neighbors, knowing your children. At the southern part, we see a much higher density. That's a private development. However, what was interesting that we noticed is many Emiratis actually moved into that private development. So we asked why, and they said it's actually much more comfortable. There were some privacy issues, granted that. Some of the scale of the housing was not enough. But they said that the kids can play, they actually know their neighbors, and the quality of the public realm was much larger. So the task became, how can we take what people enjoy in those new planned communities and try to do a new paradigm for national housing? Now, there's very strict guidelines that we have to follow in terms of planning for national housing in Abu Dhabi. One is that every citizen is entitled to a 30 by 36 meter plot. Now, that has to be absolutely orthogonal, and that's based on the principles of equity started by like Sheikh Zayed. So that's a very tight rule we had to follow. Equity and the same size. The other important thing to say is, although we're looking at this neighborhood from the air, which maybe in terms of urban design is not as relevant, we should begin our design process at the ground level. We don't look at villa design per se, that's a different agency, there's the Abu Dhabi Housing Authority. We looked at the entrances to the villas and starting there. So Abu Dhabi's developed the Abu Dhabi Street and Utility Design tool, which is an online tool. I welcome all you to use it. There's a link at the bottom. It's actually won several awards. The most difficult part of it was not necessarily summarizing the tools, the other manuals digitally, because it takes the street design manual, the public realm design manual, utility manual, and the Estidama principles and codes them into one. It was actually balancing them and making them compatible. Now, that was not easy because, of course, it means different agencies working together and really compromising onto how do we create the best public realm that we can. So this tool is intended to be used by planners and consultants and developers alike. And we combine this with, in this exercise for the housing, with the community facility standards and ADHA's, which is the Housing Authority's manual for housing as well. So let's take a look what this would look like. So this is a screen capture from the tool's standard Emirati street. So this is a typical street. It's probably, in terms of length within the Emirate, represents about 80% of the total lengths of all streets in Abu Dhabi, because it's the most prevalent. We've been able to bring it down to about 25 meters. Our ambition would be to bring it even further for more efficiency and density. However, this is a progressive approach. We're taking it step by step. We'd like to test what this actually means to the neighborhood before moving it too far forward. So let's take a look at more of a visualization of what this is. So this tool ensures, and it actually tells you if there's conflict between utilities, if you're putting your wet water above your pipes and where stormwater can go. And it also tells you which you can plant above certain utilities and which you can't. So as long as the tool generates it, it means that it should theoretically be automatically approved by the relevant agencies of power, water, the municipalities, and the Department of Transport. So it's the design above that's the most critical. So it's really more experienced at this level. All right, so what we've been able to do here is squeeze this down by about 50%, yielding huge efficiencies. Through the application of these manuals, we've been able to reduce costs of both CAPEX and OPEX by about 30%. And that's 30% without actually creating smaller plots. This is kind of flying out because I'd like to show you how the neighborhoods are then composed. This is a technical exercise again, not just a design exercise. So it covers all the technical requirements. Currently we have about a 6-meter travel distance. Most importantly, every villa, in front of every villa, there is a sidewalk. So there is walkability ingrained in it. Everybody, of course, gets a driveway, 6-meter wide driveway. The important thing in this concept is in front of every villa plot, the frontage is exactly the same, apart from maybe it's mirrored or some trees are relocated. And again, aligning with the principles of equity, which is very hard to deal with in design, as you can imagine. Big question is parking. Now, there's huge debates on parking. You could say, why is this perpendicular parking? It could be parallel, and et cetera, et cetera. It's really the demands of the parking. What we've noticed is if we don't provide parking, it doesn't mean that parking or car ownership will necessarily go down. It means cars will be parked all over in the public realm. So we've looked at providing 4 off-street parking. There's a potential of 2 in the driveway with 4 within the villa. So this meets the requirement of 10 car parks per villa at a minimum. Depending on how the citizens design their villas, you could of course fit more within there. We look at exciting topics like trash collection. So there is trash collection in front of every house, including a recycling program that's being implemented. Street spacing or tree spacing. Every villa gets at least 1 tree in front of them, which is critical. However, the use of trees within the urban design, I'll get to that in a second, is actually done strategically by the principles of Estadama, because again, trees require water and maintenance, so we don't want them everywhere. On average, in front of a typical villa, it's about 1 to 2 trees. Our light posts are currently 40 meter. We'd like to bring them a little bit lower and bring them down to about 30 meters. So what does this mean in terms of a neighborhood? One of the things we've tried to do here as we're zooming out into a larger and larger context is to get back to a little bit more of a Farij feel. Now it's difficult to deal with essentially a mono land use plan where you don't have a lot of diversification. But what we try to do here is essentially do a nesting principles of privacy. So around the perimeter it's absolutely public, but within it gets more and more private down to the driveway. So within this area, we're able to hit about 4.7 units per hectare in terms of density, which may not seem too high, but if we consider that average villa may have 10 to 12 inhabitants, you're actually hitting, in terms of population densities, similar densities that you may find in kind of suburban Europe. So in terms of the street hierarchy, and the principle of safety is critical. One of our requirements is to absolutely minimize 4-way intersections as much as possible to minimize the risk of collision. So you'll see that there's only 4 places where that occurs, and those are at the gateways. Those are actually done intentionally, and they have small roundabouts there. These primary streets take you straight to the center, where you will find a series of parks that at various scales and various hierarchies. Most importantly, at the center of each of these Farij clusters is the masjid. This is critical because it's within walking radius of that cluster. So theoretically, just about nobody is more than 350 meters away from the mosque. And of course, there's provision for utilities as well. Most importantly, and I think this is the most relevant to today's discussion, is the public realm. On the perimeter of this, we've received a very strong direction of prioritizing cycling within Abu Dhabi. This is a huge change because only about 5 or 7 years ago, cycling was actually illegal on the streets of Abu Dhabi. Over time, we've seen a lot of development, we've seen adoption. Some of the palaces have opened up the areas just outside their walls within the city because it allowed for broad cycling and jogging tracks. So they've opened up that land. And here we're trying to integrate it into the neighborhoods themselves. So within this perimeter, you essentially have a cycling system. So nobody is also further than 350 meters from a dedicated cycle route. And these cycle routes then take you to the primary community facilities, places of work, and larger places of worship. This is the pedestrian networks as well. The most important is probably the second image, where you see a clear path, dedicated sidewalk linking, and that's represented by actually the smaller lines. Because although we don't want cars cutting through these neighborhoods and making them dangerous, we want to ensure that people can walk within the neighborhoods, access the facilities, access the parks. This is actually done by, and this is probably the biggest achievement of this layout, which is all those lines you see within that plan, the green dashed lines, do not require you to cross the frontage of a villa. Okay, so what that means is you're never crossing a driveway, you're never crossing the parking, you're always going at the signs of villas. This may seem inconsequential, but what it means is that image that you see there with the man walking with the boy is actually quite feasible because you don't have the conflict of cars being left there and being blocked. It also avoids any public-private conflict issues. And of course, so you can see you can walk 650 meters, probably in 3 or 4 different ways to cross these blocks. So the porosity is actually quite good. In terms of public open space, there's 4 smaller fields, each with different uses for a variety of ages. And then the central square where the Daily Mosque is located also provides some local retail with some sports facilities that are of a larger service. Now, in order to make this complete, that's no problem. So in order to make this complete, we also have to provide the higher order services, which are, for example, schools, which we don't want to place in the center of the fariges because it means everybody's driving through the farij to get to these schools. So they're typically placed along the periphery, linked to the bike paths, or as kind of an abstract example, they're linked to the edges in these active spines, which then host a wider variety of uses. So here, for example, you can see some schools, health clinics, the Jummah Mosque, which of course has a larger catchment. Those are designed to about 750 meter radius of catchment, so a much larger worship base. The larger parks, and of course some supporting retail and in many cases jobs as well. So how does this actually represent it? I've been showing kind of a perfect square, and we all know that very rarely do you get to design a perfect square. But this module can be warped and shifted. It does require design itself, so you cannot design just by an equation, and just because you follow those principles laid out in manuals, it doesn't mean you can achieve all your goals. They're just seen as a basic platform that needs to be met in order to achieve higher goals and create the quality of life that we desired. So you can see this is a kind of a sample design with about 1,700 villas, which is about 14,500 population. This would have 4 larger parks, 3 Jummah mosques, which is 10 masjid, 2 schools, 1, and this is a new initiative as well, is kind of a community majlis. So this is a place, this has been very popular since it was introduced about 2 or 3 years ago, which is a place for people to have larger gatherings. Also community facilities which have opportunities for training. and of course nurseries. So you can see within this perimeter, it's a lot of daily use, So theoretically, you don't have to go past your neighborhood to meet your daily needs. And this should ensure complete sustainable communities. Around the perimeter, you see, of course, this is part of a larger master plan. I can see it's a little bit difficult to see on that screen, but this is just the residential component. Outside of there, of course, you have the larger businesses, the banks, the commercial districts, the larger parts of the city. But it's important to note. Yes, no, I'm finished. My last word on this would be, in talking about humanizing cities, I think the fundamental principle is respect. If we look at the principles of Estinama that we've laid out, it's about respect to the environment, it's about respect to the culture, of course the respect to the religion, it's about respect economically and the gifts that we receive in making our lives possible. And even for the people within the neighborhoods, it's about how can we shape them? How can they walk in a way? How can everybody walk in those comfortable areas? So respect can really be the cornerstone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. So we're going to start the Q&A session, and we'll take question from the center, please. Just 1 minute, Abu Muhammad Farhat.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. شكرا جزيلا على العرض الشيق. طبعا
In English, if you can, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the good presentation. I think this model is nice, but it will not suit our theme in the conference. First of all, the density you propose is very, very, very low. It's 4.7 person per dwelling per hectare, which means around 20 person per hectare, which is under any category. It is very low, which make two side effects. One, it will give you very high cost of development of the infrastructure. The second, it will be isolate people. I don't think people will walk in this community. The density is low, the distance become far from each other, so you will force them to use the car. It's okay, there is a lot of walkways, but you did not put enough people to support your theme, to make people relate to each other and to put them together. It needs to increase at least to have 400, you have to have more than 20 times more density to let this place to be walkable, or we call it humanizing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You can respond.
Thank you for the comment. I completely agree. What this initiative is essentially taking baby steps. Maybe we'd like those steps to be a little bit broader, but actually this is probably doubled, maybe even tripled the densities that we've had in the previous schemes, mainly done in the 90s and the early 2000s. Density is critical, because if you don't have the density, you cannot have services that can then support that density, so people feel more isolated, and it's really a vicious cycle that you're describing. There is a fine line between the ideal density. I don't know if that can really be defined. It has to take into a lot of cultural questions as well. We're dealing with the challenge of having to use the 30 by 36 meter plot, which is a legacy that's being implemented. Bringing that density to what we have now, even within this plan, has actually allowed us to provide some of the least community serving retail in those clusters that's economically viable. The other thing is, yes, you won't have enough people for some of that serendipitous meeting and encounter, but at least the fundamental services like the parks, the daily mosque, if they're within 350 meters, that is walkable. Maybe not all year round, granted, the climate is a challenge, but during at least half of the year, that 5-minute walk to the mosque should be feasible. We're hoping to do more. We're looking at different areas into which maybe more density would be appropriate, and different models. The Abu Dhabi government has just launched a private initiative called المدن, which is a private arm responsible for housing, for Emirati housing, hoping to accelerate the process and raising the quality further.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas. This side, yes, please. سماعة لا اسمع. ميكروفون.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I want to commend you on saying that the whole, everything goes back to respect, and that's the core value of humanizing cities. And I think it's really important because a lot of times people have this notion that humanizing cities is focused on one element like health or walkability, livability, but they forget culture and religion, which is a core element of especially the nations that are Muslim countries. And when you are making them livable, you want to continue to maintain those values of religion and culture within them and enhance them through this. And I wanted to ask you, in terms of making it walkable, some of the things that you could do is, in terms of the mosque development, to have huge fields or parks outside that were discussed yesterday with the mayor from Indonesia, is that to have more parks and to make it more green, which will be an element that instills the element of awareness of public health, because then people will be walking there, there'll be meeting points after Jummah or Eid or something like that. So that is a very important element, is to make it walkable. And I think it's very lacking in many countries around the world, and that's something that would be wonderful to instill in many cities around the world. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. I'm glad you picked up on that. Maybe I didn't emphasize it even enough, but the mosque is really at the heart of that community. The difference from what I learned is having the Jummah mosques along the higher grade streets, but having the daily mosques within the heart of the community. This is not how we used to do it before. We used to have some of the Jummahs also embedded within the communities, which then created a level of personalization that wasn't appropriate. The daily mosque and that cluster had a lot of discussions and debates about how it should be, because one of the challenges was we do want to make it as open as possible. However, some of the uses and activities that are clustered there may not actually be appropriate. So for example, we have rules about GSM towers for cell phones and their proximity to mosques so that they do not compete vertically with the minarets, for example, so they always have to be offset. And that's just a technical level. But also in terms of the play fields, if you noticed in the image, the larger play fields were not right next to the mosque. There's more of a setback of a plaza first, then you have a little bit of a buffer in the local serving retail, and then it goes into the parks. The idea is still the family can gather there, the neighbors can meet there, some people can go pray, then they can meet outside, the kids can be playing there, and it is seen as this gathering area that really does belong more or less to the neighborhood. Of course, everybody is welcome in, but there is a certain kind of ownership to it, so thanks for noticing.
This side? Anybody from this side? Abu Suhaib. هنا الفرنت رو.
اسمح لي دكتور أنا حتكلم بالعربي. Can use your headphone please.
I can.
يعني أنا دائما إحنا نرى نماذج جيدة مثل النموذج اللي وجدناه، ولكن هذا بسبب أنه كان هناك تطوير شامل للحي تصميما وتنفيذا. أنا سؤالي حقيقة المحاضر عن هل هناك تجارب أخرى سواء في أبو ظبي أو في مدن أخرى تتم بطرق أخرى تقليدية ونصل للنموذج اللي شاهدناه من ناحية حسن التخطيط وحسن التنفيذ. إشكاليتنا دائما بشكل عام هي التنفيذ. لن نرى نموذج مثل هذا ما لم ينفذ المشروع ككل. عندما ننفذه على مراحل سنكتشف أنه هناك إشكاليات كثيرة. أنا أسأل هل في أبو ظبي مثلا أو في الأمارات بشكل عام هل يسمحوا بالبناء بنفس الأسلوب المتبع في المملكة مثلا هنا، أنه يبنى الحي على مدى تقريبا 10 إلى 20 سنة، بينما يعني أو في الغرب مثلا أو في الدول الغربية يعني هل يسمح بمثل هذه النماذج وإيش تأثيرها وإيش رأيك أفضل نموذج من ناحية التكلفة الاقتصادية ومن ناحية الجودة، يعني تجمع كل النواحي هذه وبنفس الوقت نحصل في النتيجة في النهاية على نماذج جيدة للأحياء؟
That's an excellent question, and it's definitely a fundamental challenge. The roadmap that was laid out here in terms of the vision, some of the principles, those tools to getting there, and then some of the code to actually how the buildings are, do not address what you're actually asking about, which is, okay, how does this actually get built, by whom, in what order, when. The image I showed with the distinct splits between the top of the screen and the lower part of the screen actually shows two methodologies. The top one is preparation of utilities by one contractor and then allowing people to build over time, basically when appropriate to them. This has experienced a lot of stresses and a lot of challenges, primarily because we fell into another negatively reinforcing loop, which was we couldn't convince a lot of the other government entities, for example, the education. So the schools were moving in because the capacities weren't there. Some of the mosques weren't built because there weren't enough people there. And what happened is people weren't moving there because there weren't schools and there weren't mosques. So a lot of these areas experienced this checkerboard development, which was really isolating and was not a neighborhood in any sense. It was literally a scattering of houses. The Modon initiative that I mentioned hopes to address some of that. It's a delicate balance because, of course, you want people to build the homes that are appropriate to their families and to their lifestyles in a certain order. But at the same time, you want certain efficiencies. Those efficiencies come with scale and repetition. So in certain areas, there are turnkey villa developments that essentially launch it. All the villas are built and they're handed out to then just be detailed in terms of hardware by the locals. However, there's now becoming a hybrid approach through Modon in which neighborhood is organized. It is slated to be developed in a certain amount of time, and then strategic loans are given out to the citizens to build within a certain amount of time. A submodel to that is actually that the government will build those villas for you, and there's a suite of about, I think it's about 8 to 10 villa typologies that people can choose and adapt to their liking and style. What this means is that construction happens at once, at a larger scale, at a more efficiency, at a better cost, and most importantly, the community facilities and the public realm, which is most often neglected, can be delivered at the same time. It's not easy. Sometimes not all people will move in, but so far that's been the most successful model that we've experienced.
Thank you, Mr. Lopez. Dr. Makarimis.
I would like to congratulate you for a wonderful presentation and wonderful job. I hope, inshallah, it will be implemented sometime. However, I did not see enough shadow or shade. I would have liked to see more shadow so that people walking would not be exposed to the heat of our area. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the comment. I actually love that comment. There's something, there's a term we use in Abu Dhabi a lot of times in urban design, and you're right, it's underrepresented in the presentation, and that's the gift of shade. It's a challenge because we're balancing it with the Estidama principles of water use, but of course it's also necessary for the creation of a microclimate and to making walkability more feasible during those shoulder seasons when it's starting to be unbearable. What we've been able to do is actually identify what we call primary walking paths, because Although Estidama requires minimal water use, they also require 70% shading along primary walking paths. This isn't everywhere, so we've identified strategic ones, which are the ones that take you directly to the mosque and then directly to the outside larger facilities. So when it becomes unbearable in the summer, you don't do a direct line, as many of us I'm sure have experienced. You go to the side a little bit to take advantage of that shade, because although it may be a little bit further, it's actually going to be much more comfortable in that walk, and that experience really will change the neighborhood and still allow us to meet those sustainability goals. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lucas, for your very nice presentation. And we are going to prepare the stage for the main event. And our keynote speaker, the next one. You can just
Thank you.
Thank you. The next keynote speaker, or the main event for this conference, Mr. Joel Kotkins, described by the New York Times as America's Uber geographer. Joel Kotkins is an internationally recognized authority on global economic, political, and social trends. His new book, The Human City, Urbanism for the Rest of Us, was published last year by Gate Press. I think I think this is a very smart move from the organizer to bring some authority like this, an author of The Human City, and we want to see the point of view of the non-architect and planners. He classified as historian, and we want to see his views, and he's quite different than what Mr. Farahat now, he's calling for high density, he's calling for low density, he's calling for suburban against center city. So we will hear this presentation. I think it's very interesting to see and hear from the other side. What's the point of view of our theme in this conference? I think The Human City is quite a nice book, and I read a lot of reviews about this book in the internet, and we want to allow him to present to us about his work in this regard, and please take the floor now.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to express my gratitude for coming here, particularly to this great historic city. And my background and interest has always been in history. I'm not an architect, I'm not a planner, so I can just basically say what I believe, and hopefully you'll at least like some of it. And I want to just go through some of the basic theories and sort of approaches. And again, I'm very much thrilled. I never thought I'd get to see this historic city in my lifetime. So again, I'm very grateful to that. Now, I have to say, although I studied Aristotle as a student, it was a Muslim friend of mine as I was writing The Human City who, I guess like the Europeans of the Middle Ages, I got exposed to the best ideas of the ancient Greeks through the Arabs. And basically, the question is, why do we build cities? Sometimes we just think to build them. Do we build them to reduce the carbon footprint? Do we build them to create great monuments to ourselves or playgrounds for the rich and famous? Or do we build them, as Aristotle said, a city comes into being for the sake of life, but exists for the sake of living well? And I think that should be like sort of the mantra at the very central point of why we build cities and how we build cities. So I thought the presentation right before was actually had a lot of very promising aspects to it, as opposed to what I see in so many countries. And I'm going to try to go through some of both the historical derivation of these ideas, but also to understand what the issues really are. So we really start off very interestingly when we start looking at how we got to where we are now. And interestingly enough, and this is from a German study, actually the medieval city had much more space per person than the city that evolved during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, we sort of put a primary emphasis on tremendous degrees of density. Of course, in those days, people mainly walked to work. You know, if you go and see how people lived, I take my daughters to a museum called the Tenement Museum in New York City, and they said, this is how your grandparents lived and your great-grandparents lived. And it really wasn't very attractive. At that time, the Lower East Side of New York City was the densest place in the world. And why we want to sort of recreate that is sort of beyond me. And this is the Victorian industrial city. It's very attractive, as you can see. Probably today it's been stripped down and turned into hipster condos, but it wasn't a very good place to live. All sorts of health issues. By the way, health issues that my colleagues at MIT have written a lot about that are very, very negative, both for family and for health, and somehow that doesn't get included. So again, when the last presentation, that's one of the things that would be most promising is what would it be for families, what would it be for health? And we forgot this during the Industrial Revolution, and we're in the process of forgetting it again today, and so I'm sort of warning not to go in that direction. I think one of my great heroes is Ebenezer Howard, who writing in at the earliest part of the 20th century, was looking at London at the time and saying, do we really want this? Do we really want to force people to live in very high density communities? Is there a better way? And he came up with the Garden City, and that would still be a lot of the idea that I would really embrace. It said, town and country must be married, and out of this joyous union will spring a new hope, a new life, a new civilization. And some of that was done in the United Kingdom, and some of it's being done today. One place actually very popular with people from Saudi Arabia is Irvine, California, which really has many of these same characteristics. Is it perfect? No. But is it a great place to live? Is it a great place to raise a family? And I would think that is the most important single thing. It is. So this idea of being able to combine the advantage of the countryside and the advantage of the city is really one of the great things that we should be trying to aspire to, particularly when we are in land-rich countries like Saudi Arabia, like Australia, like the United States and Canada. Now, the other alternative is what one might call the Corbusian city. You know, when Corbusier came to New York City, he said, oh my God, it's not dense enough. He said it was just, he thought that even at that stage, he wanted this idea of these very tall buildings, and then there would be open space around that. And that's still kind of the mindset of a lot of our planners today. I was recently speaking on the exact same topic in Beijing a couple months ago, and you can see what they're doing in Beijing. And if you go to the old foreign concessions or the old parts of Beijing and Tianjin that have not been yet, in quotes, modernized, you see wonderful street traffic and people walking in great little shops. And then you go to the new blocks with all the subways and trains, and it is a very, very empty place. There's nobody on the streets. And so at the end of the talk, a bunch of young Chinese, what we would call in the United States millennials, came to me. They said, we don't want to live the way that the planners and our betters are telling us to live. We want to live in a more human way. And this Corbusian city, it has a kind of mathematical logic to it, but it has no human logic to it. So where do I think we're headed? And this is maybe being optimistic. I think what we're seeing in the geography and the demography is growth is moving towards dispersion within city and the shift to smaller ones. The megacities are actually beginning to lose market share. I do think at some point cities get so big, so complex, that they're really not very nice places to live. Now, if you're in the upper classes, you can sort of buy your way out of it. You can get a very big apartment, you can have a country house, you could spend the summer in London. There's lots of things you can do. But for the average person, this doesn't work very well. And so what we're seeing is many governments, including the government in China and in India, are beginning to say maybe we want to start to disperse people into some of the second-tier cities. The megacity model, for the most part, doesn't work very well. I've spent quite a bit of time in Mumbai, for instance. I don't know, would another 5 million people in Mumbai make it nicer? I think it's almost at the point of being unlivable now. Very important point, and this is an area I think where we have some common ground. I'm very family-oriented. I come from a very family-oriented culture. Density doesn't work with families. If you look at all the places in the US in which families are virtually extinct, they are the densest places in the country. Families, generally speaking, want a little bit of space. They want some exposure to nature, and I can show you that statistically. So I think we have to come up with a new urban model. Does it mean that we recreate the production suburbs of the 50s? No, we now have technology that can lead us to something that's better, that's more sustainable, and that's what I want to leave you with today. Now, obviously, the world is growing tremendously in its urban population, so these issues affect everybody, not just here, but all around the world. And so how we proceed with urbanization is a very, very critical issue. Now, what is the historical perspective? You know, when we go back to 1800 and 1850 and then back to current times, what we see is actually densities in many of our great cities have been declining for a long time. The Paris that my wife's family is from Paris, the Paris of even the 1920s and 30s, much denser than the Paris of today. If we look at the metropolitan areas, they are generally less dense than they were before. There's a reason for this, because fundamentally for issues of affordability, but also for issues of preference, particularly when people get into their 30s and late 20s and start thinking about having a family, they want to move out. My own family left Brooklyn, New York, and moved to Long Island when I was 5. Again, good schools, access to nature. So I was able to live 35 minutes from Manhattan, one of the great places in the world to spend time in. But I still had in my backyard access to woods that had been left open. I think this is very, very important in the development of children. And in the book, I talk a lot about what the health effects are, what the psychological effects on children are of having exposure to nature. What we can see in many of the countries that are emerging, India being a good example, the real growth now is in smaller cities. Fewer and fewer people moving into Mumbai, more and more people moving into second and third tier cities. This is beginning to happen as well in China, as you can see here. And actually the Chinese government is basically does not want to grow its big cities anymore. They realize they've hit a certain inflection point where it really is dehumanizing and difficult. I mean, I can tell you as somebody who's lived in Los Angeles and Southern California, so I have a lot of appreciation for the water issues and the desert issues. Los Angeles was in many ways a more pleasant place to live, and I can tell you almost every Angelino will tell you this, when it had 10 million people as opposed to 20 million people. So I think we are seeing this movement to smaller cities. That's why a city like Medina would be such an interesting place to do development, because it's still at that early stage where it can actually still be a human city. Once you get to a certain size, it becomes very difficult. So let's take a look at some migration patterns. The New York Times would not like to talk about this, and they continue to ignore what the census is telling us for their own reasons. But what we're seeing is in America, we did have a period in which the large cities were doing better, and where people were they weren't growing faster than the smaller cities, but they were doing better. Ever since about 2014, it's now completely gone the other way, and people are going to smaller and smaller cities. Fastest growing cities in America right now are places like Boise, generally smaller cities, increasingly. That seems to be what's happening, as I'll show you some interesting statistics on that as well. The other thing is the people moving the suburbs. The planners and some of the development community, because this is in their interest, think that the suburbs are going to die. They were going to be the new slums, and nobody was going to be there, and all the millennials were never going to go there. And then, of course, what happened was the millennials started getting older. They started having families, and guess what? They moved to the suburbs. What we're seeing is suburban growth is now growing much, much faster, and it's actually the outer suburbs that are growing the fastest. Now, some of it is cost issues, but a lot of it is quality of life issues. So this process where we're being told that everybody wants to move into the dense city and that's where they're going, just really isn't showing up certainly in the American experience that we can see, and this goes even to the 2017 census. Take a look at New York City, again, my hometown. Very rapid growth in New York. I think by far the greatest city in North America. But in 2010, it was population growth was 92,000. Now it's down to 21,000. Meanwhile, the net out-migration has continued to accelerate. This is even happening in the San Francisco Bay Area. San Jose has big net out-migration, reduced population growth. And San Francisco, which during the tech boom actually was growing, is now beginning to lose domestic migrants. So clearly something is happening in the United States that's worth looking into. One of the big issues, which of course most architects and planners don't seem to care too much about, what do people want? It seems to me a logical question you ought to ask. Well, what we find is when we ask people where would they like to live, actually they like rural areas, they like suburban areas. The percentage who want to live in a dense urban area has been pretty consistent, about 20%, and that includes the inner ring suburbs. So people are actually preferring a less dense environment. Now, there are lots of reasons you might not want to do that, but I think that to understand what human aspiration is, and again, to go back to Aristotle, that's what we should be keeping foremost in our mind. What is it that people want? What's going to make a better environment for families? I think that has to be at the top of the agenda, and I think it almost doesn't exist. You can read all the new urbanists, smart growth proposals, books by architects and urbanists, and the word family barely exists in these books. I've gone through hundreds of pages and looked for the word family. It doesn't exist. To me, the family is the absolute center of everything, and if you don't start there, I don't even know why you're building cities, because basically you're building it for people who are not going to have another generation. And of course, Margaret Mead, certainly no conservative, said no matter how many communes anybody invents, the family always creeps back. The person who thought they'd never get married, the person who thought they never would have children, ends up getting married and having children. Maybe not at the age that they did before, not maybe as exclusively, but in healthy societies, that's where people go. Now, what I'm seeing as I work, I've done a lot of work in Asia, and particularly for Singapore, and what we're finding is that many of these high-density cities have very, very low replacement rates. In other words, they're not creating enough children to replace the current generations. It seems that density discourages people from having children. We're pretty sure that that's true. It's not the only thing, but it is a major factor, and it seems to correlate almost in every case. Obviously, the most extreme case is Japan, a place I've spent a great deal of time in. About 2,000, the population of 65 and over, passed the population under 15. By 2050, there will be more people over 80 than under 15. I don't understand how that is a sustainable long-term prospect. I suppose, you know, if you really want to reduce the human population, maybe it's going to be good, but it's going to be very difficult for those young people to support all of us older people who will be no longer working. And one of the reasons why Japan's economy has basically stagnated for about 20 years, one big part of that is the fact that it became too expensive, and the kind of urban civilization that you develop just discourages people from having children. So if we look at the projections, the UN is more optimistic. They think Japan will go from about 130 million to slightly under 100 million by 2100. The Japanese themselves, they think it's going to go down to about 65 million. So we're seeing something we've never seen before. Outside of major wars or plagues, this kind of reduction in population. And some of it you may not be doing anything about, be able to do anything about, but it's certainly something we should be thinking about over time. China, similar issues. China already has a rapid aging problem. They have very expensive housing, very dense housing. What's interesting is when they got rid of the one-child family policy, it made no difference because people can't afford to have children anyway. And there's something about this kind of urban lifestyle which has many attractions to it, but if it becomes the only and workable alternative, people simply will not have children unless they're very wealthy. I mean, people on the Upper East Side of Manhattan can have kids because they can afford 5-bedroom apartments and they have a house in Connecticut and maybe a condo in Florida. But for the average person, this is not even an option. One of the biggest things happening in demography is the reduction in the 15 to 19-year-olds in China. China's reduction in 15 to 19-year-olds is basically recreating global demography in a very, very profound way. And again, a lot of it has to do with dense urbanization. You see the same things in places like Korea. If you go to Seoul, even their suburban areas are extraordinarily dense. And I remember going to visit a Buddhist monk and asking, why is this happening? He says, well, if you have to be on a train for an hour to get into Seoul that's packed, and you have this long commute, and by the time you get home, you're too tired to have children. And then you have your mother-in-law there too, so it's even worse. So basically what we're seeing is this kind of density is creating what might even be thought of as a kind of post-familial society, which is something that I've written about a great deal. So where do people have children? Well, in the United States, as you can see, the suburbs, the exurbs, even the earlier suburbs, all have children much more than the urban core or even the urban ring, the immediate suburban ring. So fundamentally, there is some direct correlation between density and where people have children. Here's a little map that my colleague Ali Medeiros did, and you can see very, very low percentages of children in particularly the more prosperous parts of Manhattan. Actually today in Manhattan, the majority of households are not only childless, but they're single. Is this the evolution of society we want? I'm not so sure that's where I'd like to go. The other thing that we found that I thought would be interesting is we sort of plotted the religiosity and fertility, and there's a direct relationship. So one of the things that seems to happen in a lot of the urban societies is religion itself begins to decline. There isn't the sort of the room for families. Family is one of the big reasons why you are involved with religion. We've seen this direct relationship, and what you see is that whole parts of the United States, the inner parts of London, have become essentially religion-free zones. And again, I don't think that's necessarily such a good thing. We're starting to see the beginnings here. Now, I know you still have a fairly high fertility rate here in Saudi Arabia, but we do know that other countries in the Middle East and North Africa now have fertility rates below that of the United States. So this can happen in a Muslim society as well as in a non-Muslim society. So the good things that I think we can do. First of all, I think we have to learn from the past. The past is very present in my life, what I tell my children, how I motivate them. I think the past is something that is a precious thing that we give to our children. And cities need to be three things in my book, The City, A Global History. They're busy, safe, and sacred. Busy is commerce, safe is secure, and sacred. This sacredness of cities. When I was writing The City, one of the things the book was really based a lot about reading diaries of people at the time. And I remember reading Marco Polo's writings, other people's writings, Ibn Battuta, and the religion was, whether it was Muslim or another religion, it was at the center of the urban life. The older forms provided important models both for the environment and social sustainability. We have to think of sustainability not as something that's just about GHG, it's also about the sustainability of a society as well. Density and modernism have their role. It's exciting to have a Dubai, it's exciting to have a Manhattan. It just can't be the basis of your society in the long run. So early cities, this is they gave us some of the hints about what we wanted to do. And let's try to think about how we can learn from the past. We don't repeat the past, but we learn from it, we incorporate it. And again, I thought that was a very good aspect of the last presentation. So a little bit of work I've tried to do, I've been reading a lot and consulting some of my friends about these issues. We think, what is Islamic society about, and urbanity? The importance of literacy is important. The centrality of community is important. I thought it's very important that people have a sense of community, that they're not living in these sort of Soviet-style apartment blocks, which really have no real sense of community. And by the way, when people talk about the suburbs and people don't know each other, actually, the surveys will tell you that people in the suburbs, particularly if they own their homes, are much more involved with their neighbors than people who live in the city. Consultation is obviously important. We're doing that now. Civil society is important. I think the development on the combination of spirituality and practicality is very, very important. One great advantage of Islam is a very, very good book now out about the Mideast as the creator of capitalism, is the fact that in the Muslim societies, as opposed to particularly the Christian societies, they didn't look down on commerce, and that's a great advantage. Equality is obviously important, and the importance of travel. So when we're looking at the Islamic city, you had a desert culture, and coming from Southern California, lived in Southern California since 1975, I understand what it's like to live in a water-short environment. And they developed the idea of a walled garden, the idea of the urban ideal as a celestial garden, and it merged with already existing forms in the Mesopotamian and Persian notions about how you can take a dry climate and make it more human and more pleasant. So an architect friend of mine, a Muslim architect, he said these were some very good examples, he thought, of how you can create a cooler, more humane environment looking at the past. And use of shallow water features to cool down the house. I even remember going to the Teotihuacan outside of Mexico City, and how they built up in the Mexican highlands buildings and structures that actually were remarkably cool, even in the heat of the day. They knew things that we should learn from today, how we build buildings. And I think it's really important. And one of my favorite parts of the city was reading an Arab visitor of Delhi in the 16th and 17th century, and one of what I would think is the great ideal, a Garden of Eden that is inhabited. That's what we want to try to at least try for as we develop our cities. Neighborhoods, and again, I thought the last presentation, the importance of neighborhoods, very important in terms of sort of the coherence of society, making the city work. And there's a great history of this. So to sort of put this all together, how do you look at sustainability? Sustainability has become kind of a mathematical thing, which, by the way, is we can prove is actually often very inadequate. But we have to look at the social, the economic, the environmental. Cities are not just about, well, if we shove more people in to this space, they'll have a lower footprint and everything will be wonderful. I don't think that that's the direction we need to go in. Urban civilization has to be sustainable on a social level, on a familial level. So here's some ideas about rethinking density. I think low mid-density using proper design and landscaping could use less water and energy. I'm working right now on Houston after their floods, the exact opposite of what Southern California and Saudi Arabia have to deal with, but how we could use suburban developments as ways of catching water supplies and retaining waters to protect us from floods. Heat islands. This is an issue that seems to have disappeared in the environmental literature, but has been there for a long time, and I'll show you a little graph that will show you that. We knew how to build cities. You know, when the Spanish and then the Mexicans came to Southern California, guess what they did? They built courtyard houses, many of them actually derivations of what the Arabs had built in Spain. They were one story, they had courtyards, they had trees, they had shade. It works in Southern California to have that kind of house. I've owned them, so they're pretty terrific. We have to be looking at using new technology to get to our environmental goals instead of trying to shove people into environments they don't want to live in. Now, I thought you might find this interesting because Phoenix is sort of similar to what you have here. It's very hot. It's considerably warmer than Southern California. And as you can see, the temperatures, the variations are extreme, at least 3 degrees centigrade between the suburban residential and the park districts and the commercial areas. For downtown Phoenix to be filled with steel and glass towers is almost insane. And if you go to the older neighborhoods of Phoenix, again, single story, Spanish style, and it works much better. I wanted to just have a little bit of exposure for you of work that my colleagues that I work with at MIT about things that they are trying to do in this region. And again, very similar to what I showed you earlier, sort of courtyard as living space to replace air-conditioned indoor space with shaded outdoor space. I think this is quite beautiful what they've been trying to do. The other thing is on CO2 emissions. This is a study done by the environmental group in Australia. They actually felt when you dealt with all the various uses of electricity, the parking garages, the common spaces, the core actually had fairly high processes. One of the things that we found really interesting in terms of GHG, one of the things we found is California, which is trying to densify as fast as possible. We ranked 35th out of 50 states in reduction of GHG since 2007, since we started on this process. And anyone who's tried to get around Los Angeles in the last few years knows that it hasn't worked very well. There are other wonderful opportunities that are in front of us. We don't have to go back to the industrial city. We don't have to go back to Corbusier. We can do something different because God has given us these great tools to work on. One of the things I've been very interested in is the idea of people working at home. You know, my favorite days, I've worked at home all but 3 months of my life, my working life, and you know, one of my favorite days are the days I don't even start the car. I ride my bike a lot. I work at home. Not everybody can work at home, but it's amazing to me that we would spend billions of dollars trying to get people to go onto transit systems when so much of their work could actually be done at home. Lots of very good things for families as well. You know, my daughters have always been exposed to my visitors from other countries who've come to see me, or people I work with, or even they know that, you know, Daddy actually does something. I think it's an important idea. And what's interesting, in Southern California now, we have more people working at home than we do riding transit. It cost us $0 to have people work at home. It cost us $16 billion to have a transit system that has less riders than it did in 1990. So this process is happening. It fits with families. It fits with women going into the workforce, which is something I'm sure that you'll be seeing much more here in Saudi Arabia. This is a great opportunity. Again, not for everybody, but you know, my old plumber in LA, he worked out of his house. He had his truck all decked out with plumbing supplies, and he needed to go, but he didn't have to have an office or a place of business. He worked right out of his house. I think you're going to see more and more of this. And again, the rewards for families, the flexibility for people to still work and take care of children are pretty paramount in my mind. Going further, again, my friends at MIT are working on this now, is what happens when we get autonomous vehicles. Saudi Arabia is a wealthy country, and it's a developing country, and has the opportunity to take advantage of this technology. Eventually, what we're looking at is in the next 10 to 20 years, we can have solar-charged autonomous vehicles, huge amounts of space that will be open for parks, for houses, for making life more pleasant. I think this is coming. We're in the beginning stages of that already with the more efficient cars, with electric cars, and I think this is going to become even more the case with the autonomous car. And this will probably lead to greater decentralization. This is a Bain company study that showed that basically by 2025, we will have more people living in the outer exurbs than living in the core. Again, if you take away the horrors of traffic and driving, or you reduce them, this is going to make living in a dispersed manner much more attractive. So at the end, I just want to leave you with this. Again, Aristotle, as usual, got things right. We have to ask ourselves, what is the city for? What exactly is our purpose? Are we leaving for our children an unsustainable social environment, an environment where they don't want to have kids and where their kids are going to have all sorts of psychological issues? I'm not necessarily sure that's what we want to do. We have to start thinking about whether or not we want to be a post-familial society. And I think we're going to have to figure out, how do we build cities that accommodate religion, families, and a sort of more balanced life. I know this is probably not going to be very popular with a lot of planners and architects who want to sell you products, but I thought it was my obligation to share those thoughts with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. Please. So we're going to start as usual from the center. There is quite points that we have to think about: the low density versus the high density, the low birth rate and higher birth rate, and the growing cities. How we're going to make a human city in our local environment here. علي الشعيري, Dr. Ali. سمع second.
Thank you for this great presentation, which is full of a lot of figures. But my difficulty of drawing conclusions from averages has very dangerous results. If you put somebody's head in a deep freezer and his foot in an oven, you'll have a conclusion in the average, he is in the comfort zone. So in the early presentation of figures relating different urban areas, without looking into the reason why these happens, we draw conclusions that are not useful. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, I don't know how else we proceed without looking at what the correlations are. It's universal, virtually every place I've worked and studied, that high-density environments have fewer children than lower-density environments. That's just almost universal, particularly in developed countries. And then if you look at what people want, the surveys are there. So a lot of this is statistically based. It's not based on images. I just thought the images would be revealing, but this is very, very much done with a lot of data. I didn't become, what the Times called an Uber geographer just by showing images. So I think it's never a direct relation. But one thing we find is in the first generation of people who move to the city, they sometimes will have larger families. The next generation will not. And as people become urbanized, they just won't have families. Now, some of that is good. Some countries have much too high birth rates. But I think if we look long-term, particularly my experience working in Asia, within 20, 30 years going from societies that were panicked, that they were losing out to overpopulation, are now desperately trying to get people to have children. In Singapore, we did a focus group with a bunch of successful women, and they said, well, how much money should the government give you to have a kid? When we got to $1 million, and they said they still weren't going to have them, we sort of gave up. And what they said is, in a highly competitive society that's very expensive and space is at a premium, having children is not a great option.
This side. Others? Front row. الصف الأول لو سمحتي.
I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm working with NEOM, so we're looking at technology in the fourth industrial revolution. And what I want to ask you is to advise how technology and the cities of tomorrow can be structured in a way where family life is a huge component and culture is maintained, yet technology can actually help that instead of removing that.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very much something that we miss out on with technology. The one thing is obviously the ability to work at home. Traditional societies, working at home was quite common. Even when you go to the old tenement museums in New York, a lot of the work was done at home. My mother tells me stories about supporting her family by sewing buttons onto women's dresses at home in New York. So I do think that we have an opportunity to put very high-end work into the environments where people are at home. Sometimes when I have an issue with my phone, I'll call. Very often I'll get a woman working literally in a rural community in Nebraska who's helping to support her family, but she can still watch her kids. I think this idea of the technology based at home. The other thing is the autonomous vehicle. There's a presentation my colleague at MIT is doing, which shows this sort of integration of the family in the autonomous future. Where you call a vehicle to get your kids. You call a vehicle for your to get to work. There's much more green space and open space. I think these are things that really technology will allow us to do if we look at it. But the thing that has to happen is planners have got to put the family and community first, and not just ideas of efficiency. I've done a lot of writing about Silicon Valley and the philosophy of some of the larger tech companies. It's very interesting. They're very explicit. We want people without children in their 20s, and if they're not American citizens, it's even better, because then they have a lot of leverage over them. Meanwhile, they end up with gigantic houses and kids. It's convenient for some of these companies to have people who have no lives. I mean, the idea, well, I'm better off with a person whose entire life is there working for me. Well, that's not a sustainable society. It has to be you have to have families, or else you have nothing. Not just in terms of raw numbers, but the quality of the families. We know very well that intact families do much better than families that are where there's only one parent, or where one parent is never around. Even better to have the grandparents nearby. Actually, one of the things that's happening now, it's very interesting, in Irvine, California in particular, because I've done work with the Irvine company, is multi-generational housing. It's become very, very popular. And it's particularly popular with Armenians, people from the Middle East, people from China, people from India, because the idea of either having the child live at home until they get married, or having the grandparent living, and they now have these units where either the child who's not married, or the grandparent actually has their own entrance and their own little kitchen, so they've got their privacy, but they're part of the household. I think this is a great development, and so I think there are so many things we can do that are just so much intuitively better than what we're doing now, which is separating everybody into little boxes where they have very little contact with each other.
This side, Dr. Malcolm, have it, please. Microphone. ميكروفون يا شباب.
Thank you very much for your talk. And as we were talking earlier, I really appreciate your re-emphasis, if you will, on where most people actually live, which is in suburban environments, not in the centralized core. And there's a lot of over attention to the core, it seems to me. I think you're absolutely right about that. But on the other hand, shouldn't we also be thinking about how to make these suburban places more, give more choice, not be trapped in your car, be able to access, retail and amenities and schools and so on close by. In other words, not so much density in the abstract, but a high density or low density, but organization, more sort of sensibly organized. Shouldn't that be more of the focus on, if you will, humanizing the suburbs?
I think that's a great point, and I know you've done some work in that direction. Yeah, I mean, what I'm seeing, I'll give you a really good example, is in the Austin area. Austin's the most rapidly growing region in the United States, or has been that for quite a while. They have this thing called the Domain, which is in the north end. It's a lot of tech companies, and it's a walkable, dense area surrounded by single-family homes. So people who live in those surrounding suburbs go into the Domain instead of trying to go into downtown Austin. And then for many younger people, people without children, people whose children have left, they can live in this area called the Domain. And a lot of cities and suburban areas are doing that. Irvine's doing that in parts. Valencia's doing it in parts. So it's a way of sort of bringing, to go back to Ebenezer Howard, having that sort of quasi-rural environment, but with all the advantages of urban life. some of the better suburbs around London are built that same way. So I agree completely. We don't want to necessarily go back to the Levittowns, to the mass production suburbs of the 1950s. That was a response to the post-war situation. And by the way, it was an enormous success for the United States, an enormous success in many places. But you're totally right. We need to be able to have numerous centers where people can work, can play. My family, we moved 3 years ago from Los Angeles to Orange County, California. And we find that there's the restaurants, the shopping, the theater, many of the things that we would do in LA, but they're actually easy to do there, great art schools. So I think that there's a lot of improvement of suburbia that can be done. And when we're building new suburbs, we don't build them like the old ones. We try to have some of the great things that make cities great, but in the context of something more dispersed.
Dr. Farhat?
Yes, thank you very much. I enjoy your presentation. I know that density is a core issue in housing, especially in humanization the neighborhood. I was at MIT 40 years ago, and this was the hot issue. And they came with between two extremes, between very high rise, as we saw yesterday, and very low rise, or low density, as we see it today. They come with a walk-up, which give us 400 person per hectare. I saw one of your chart, which show how the density declined from almost 500 to around 50 person per hectare. Maybe this is a little misleading, because maybe your examples of high density has been taken from high-rise building, which has a lot of problem. But we have good example of raising the density to a moderate level without sacrificing the social interaction between people. But if we go to a very low density, as I said earlier, we will face two problems. One is the high cost of the infrastructure, and we will have no people to support the human aspect. That's the reason 15 years ago I was at Harvard, and they came with the issue with the mixed development. They were calling against the suburb dilemma, where the children are jailed in the house, and the commercial area is so far, they go by car. So they came with the issue of the mixed use, which is, you can see it here in all our street. Our dilemma in Saudi Arabia that we have very low density. We have almost 70% per hectare, which make a heavy burden to the government to provide the infrastructure to all the houses around the kingdom. So the problem is not just in the density, is how you achieve the density in terms of buildings and urban design. We have no much good urban designer to transfer this high density, or let's say moderate density, 400, 300, to a real work that it has all this, what we need from good life and walkable city, etc. Thank you very much.
Shukran, Muhammad.
If I could, I think that, and I guess, because my background is in classical history, I always look at the Greeks and the Romans and what, there is some sort of median way of looking at it. Again, we don't want to go necessarily to the the Levittowns of the, but there are many intermediate steps that could be taken which allow for some of this. Some of the most popular suburbs, for instance, if you look at Naperville, Illinois, or Montclair, New Jersey, they are quite walkable. They have downtowns that you can walk in. They have some very nice park features, very often along rivers. Again, there are sort of median ways of doing this. I agree completely that we're not going to go back to the absolute production suburb of before. But as a former MIT person, I brought with me a copy of the book called Infinite Suburbia that was done, I'm the co-editor of, was done through MIT, and we come up with all the different variations that we think can be done that can accommodate some of the issues you're bringing up. It's got a lot, about 60 different chapters in it, but I think it would be a really good place to start.
Yeah. Dr. Farhat is an MIT graduate also. We both have the
Well, I
same.
didn't go to MIT, they just hired me, and that's all.
Our friend from Saudi Gazette, please.
Roger Harrison for Saudi Gazette. I was interested in the observation that the Industrial Revolution removed work from home. Now, that got me thinking. Recently in the UK, estimates put the advance of robotics as so threatening that within 20 years, maybe 30% of the jobs that are now done manually will be done by robots. This presents two interesting effects, perhaps. One, you're going to have massive unemployment and therefore zero income for a lot of families. And two, the robots can be controlled from home. In other words, you can use cyber technology to run businesses for the home. So in one sense, first question, do you see, as a result of robotics, perhaps the Industrial Revolution reversed because of cyber technology? And two, what are you going to do with the massive unemployed population? How are you going to finance them? Where are you going to put them?
Well, it's a terrific question, and I wish I had a terrific answer, because, you know, this has been obviously something we've been, I mean, I'm old enough to have gone through when computerization came through, there would be no jobs. Now, right now in the United States, we have a terrible labor shortage, which we historically haven't had. So how technology plays out, I mean, is really, you know, if I was to say, is more in God's hands than our hands. We never know. I did a seminar for Jeff Bezos, and Jeff asked the exact same question. And I said, well, you know, there are so many things that we never knew we needed before. I mean, one illustration, we're going to have a tremendous need for people to work with the elderly. We're going to have an aging population. I don't think the Japanese approach of, you know, I don't want my 95-year-old mother taken care of by a robot. I really don't. I think there are going to be jobs that we didn't even think will exist. There's a great debate among economists and technologists about this. I don't know enough to say one way or the other. I do know that history has shown that over time, technology moves the kinds of jobs we have. It doesn't eliminate the total number. We haven't yet gotten to that. You know, you can go back to the Luddites when in the British Industrial Revolution, where they said, well, these mechanical looms were going to create long-term unemployment, and yet it turned out that with a rough stretch, it came back. One thing we're seeing very interestingly, and something we've talked about a lot in Singapore, is that people have a greater desire, for instance, for personal services. They want handmade goods. They want food that was grown locally. Those are creating new positions. You know, in the U.S., and particularly, of course, I live in crazy California, you know, we have such a huge number of farmers markets now. People buy, you know, want clothes that are locally produced. So, you know, the history just goes in unpredictable ways. So I'm not sure that this could happen. Now, it could happen. Now, some of the people on the technology side do think that we're going to have mass unemployment, and the only way the society is going to be held together is by essentially having, you know, Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos send us a check for $5,000 a month to keep us whole. You know, I hope we don't get there. I think human beings are capable of so many things that we need, and if we progress to the point that maybe having our aesthetic needs or our health needs or our familial needs get greater attention, I don't know if that's necessarily a bad use of labor.
This side. لا شوف الصف الرابع من أول شوف هناك. أيوه. أيوه.
Thank you very much, sir, for a very intriguing and interesting presentation. I couldn't agree more. However, I am a little bit concerned about the suburbia, which is happening in America and elsewhere, and the impact of home-based work on sustainability and humanization. I think this is a very important theme that could have been thrashed out in the discussion, because the link between transportation and sustainability is very well established in the literature. It is very well known that 70% of GHG is derived from transportation sources. So when you have a home-based work, you are bound to reduce GHG, but I'm not sure that we would be having enough scales of economy to produce certain goods and services that might not have been produced otherwise. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. First of all, the reductions from home-based work are much greater than the reductions in the United States from transit use. The reality is, in most of the United States, our cities are too dispersed for traditional transit to work effectively. By the way, the percentage of, and I have 1,000 slides, I couldn't bring all of them, but the percentage of the emissions that are coming from cars have been dropping pretty dramatically. The advances that are being made by companies like Toyota are pretty profound. The cars of today are not only safer, but much, much cleaner. We're probably moving towards electric cars over the next 20 years. A lot of those may be solar powered. So I think we can reduce that. And certainly the home-based work is an enormous advantage. I live in Southern California, which, where people, drive quite a bit. I use 1 tank of gas a month. I think that's going to become more and more common. The question that we really may have to think about a lot is, when we develop our economies, how can we develop our economy so that the jobs are closer to where people live? I don't think that requires that you put everybody in a high-rise tower next to the office. But what we find is, for instance, the shortest commutes in Southern California are in places like Irvine, where there's a lot of jobs nearby, and if people drive, they drive a short distance. The longest commutes, interestingly enough, are in the center city, where a lot of poorer people have to drive or take transit that takes a lot of time to jobs, in the case of Los Angeles, on the west side of the city. So I think that there are certainly ways, and I think we're making pretty considerable progress on how much of resources, energy we're burning with cars. They really have become much, much more efficient. And again, I think home-based work and how do you do dispersion in the right way. One of our biggest problems in Southern California right now is and it's true in the Bay Area as well, the only places where people can afford to live are far away from where the workplace is. And I've been urging our government in California, which of course has no effect, which is, why don't we look at having jobs move to the Central Valley or move to the Inland Empire so that young families can afford to live there. We have a big generational issue, which is our people like me who bought their first house in LA in 1980. I've been able to ride that inflation escalator and stay in nice areas. If I was a young person in my 30s, unless I had wealthy parents or robbed a bank, there's no way I could live in those places.
Second row.
Okay, thank you very much. I come from UN Habitat, and UN Habitat is one of the voters for compact cities and for densification and the other way around of what you have mentioned. But it is good as well to see other side of the story from what you have mentioned. My question really will be around the economy and around, you have correlated the issue of density with the decline in the fertility rate in the cities. But we all know that there are many reasons for the decline of the fertility rates rather than only showing the correlation with
I didn't imply that it was the only reason.
Yeah, so my issue is the other side as well, because one of the reasons behind moving to compact city are, as Dr. Farhad mentioned and as others mentioned as well, is the cost of the infrastructure and the economic side, which is from the research that was done by UN Habitat all over the past 20 years, which was yielded in the new urban agenda for the next 20 years, is the compact cities. So, and it is fully around the economy and the cost of living and the opportunities that living in the center allows and opens for, especially that we know all the cities around the world, including the American and European cities, you will find most of the opportunities are in the center rather than the sub. So, what do you think about these two issues? Because
the two things. I know the economic part, and actually the vast majority of the jobs are not in the center city, and actually center city jobs have not been increasing over the last 4 or 5 years. There are some very elite jobs that are in center cities. There seem to be certain functions, finance, media, tend to be concentrated, but many other jobs. Silicon Valley is a gigantic suburb, and it is by far the leading technology region in the world. Most of the technology in Austin is not in the middle of the city, it's in the outside area. The great energy research area in the world today is in the energy corridor of Houston, that is also suburban. Now, it is suburban with some density. If you go out to the energy corridor around Beltway 8 in Houston, you'll see that. But there was actually, Rich Florida of all people has done some studies. Most of the patents in the United States are actually developed in low density areas. And I just think that this idea that this gives you so much opportunity is contradicted by a lot of the data. And the other thing that I think is really important to keep in mind is people have different needs at different times of their lives. My demographer friend Wendell Cox and I just did a study for CEO Executive Magazine, and we trace where people want to live by age, and it changes. People in their 20s, they want to be in Denver, Seattle, San Francisco. People in their 30s, they want to be in Austin, Dallas, Atlanta. People in their 50s and 60s, they want to be in Florida and Las Vegas and Phoenix. So as people grow up, they want different things. And one of the things that I think is happening to our core cities is, A, they've become very expensive. So the entrance for people has become very limited. The second is we're going through a demographic shift. The millennials, what we call the millennial generation, is a very big generation because they are the children of my generation, the boomers. Those people are now getting into their 30s. And there's a direct correlation that when people get into their 30s, they want to live in a different environment. By the way, what few people have studied is the great revival of New York City, which, for instance, which took place in the 1980s, was when boomers were in their 20s. Unfortunately, we're not in our 20s anymore. You know, I wish I could arrange it, but I can't. So, you know, I think that the demographics change as societies age and people age. And so you're going to see, you saw during the period of the millennials in their 20s, a surge in entrepreneurship and development in core cities. That is beginning to dissipate as they go into their 30s. The next generation is probably not going to be as large, and the unfortunate thing for the next generation, and I have children in that generation, is that many of the choices that we had to live in New York, to live in LA, to live in San Francisco, to live in London, to live in Singapore, those options may not be there for the next generation. It will be the next group of cities and regions that they'll go to.
I received a signal from the organizer that the time is up, so we'll take the last question, please.
Very good, thank you. Actually, I'm also a graduate from MIT. I was at exactly the same time with Mr. Farhan at MIT, and I will refrain from comments. I will go directly to the question. What you say is music to our ears. It reminds me of the politicians of Europe that they're getting elected. The question is, can you deliver what you preach? Can you provide it to everybody, not to you and me, that we are the rich and we can choose where we live, and when we have children, we go to the suburbs. When we don't have children, we go to the center of the city. At the same time, do you have enough resources? You work with MIT. MIT is a place that numbers prevail. Do we have enough resources to do all these things? And finally, at this point, the kingdom is building new cities. Do you take the responsibility that the new cities are going to be all suburban, and how your grandchildren are going to face something like this? And my question is, what you present is beautiful. Can you deliver?
Well, I'm not a builder, so I'm not going to deliver it. I can deliver ideas, but I think that let me put it this way. Studies of high-density housing is they're much more expensive. I mean, one of the great problems we have in California is as we've densified, the new buildings are much more expensive than the old ones that they replaced, and there's been displacement. We have a terrible problem in California, as you may know, where working-class families are paying 50–60% of their income on rent, for instance, in the LA area. So now close to 40% of the population is a paycheck from poverty. I think it is the job of society, whether it's a society like the United States and certainly a Muslim society, which is based on the idea of social justice, to figure out how to provide housing, decent housing for people, so that people who are working class have the opportunity to make these same choices that you and I are able to make. The great thing that happened in the United States in particular, but in other countries, of Levittown, that was a working class phenomenon. My uncle, who worked for Grumman Aircraft on Long Island, was able to buy a decent house and send his kid to a nice school, coming from a very, very poor family. We've lost this upward mobility, and actually it's what my next book is going to be about, is that crisis on a global level. Because if we can only provide alternatives for the affluent and the highly educated, we're going to be a failed society, and we're not going to make the progress we need to make. So I'm really appreciative of your question.
Thank you, Joel, for the exciting presentation, and
thank you.
Hope we can. Thank you for everybody, and I think now they will continue, or there is a break. I don't know. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور طلال الردادي لرئاسته الجلسة السادسة عشر، والتي كانت بعنوان المدينة الإنسانية التصميم الحضري لنا.